I think the psychedelic sector is so attractive as an investor because I think it can disrupt way more than just the mental health industry in the US. I think it can disrupt three industries, in fact, one of those being the mental health industry, but two other major industries. And I'll talk about them all today. So, first, let's talk about the mental health industry. I think you could break that down into three subcategories. The first being mental health therapies and medicines, like things that you would take. The second would be like interacting with a human being, basically therapy in any of its main forms, where you have a therapy package, whether it's like one-on-one sit and talk therapy or any other type of therapy. And the third category is like a quasi realm, where it's like a broad spectrum within that category, from like holistic coaches and um, like just non-traditional practices, the best of which on that spectrum would be people you would say, wow, they're truly remarkable, they add value, they're luminaries, they're insightful, they're wise, and they're doing amazing work. And on that spectrum, if you go to the worst, you would find the users, the abusers, the darkest, nastiest people. So that's a broad spectrum, but if you take that whole spectrum overall, you could see that you you have that whole thing is going to be disrupted, basically, in my personal opinion. Now, this is all my opinion, and this is infotainment, not financial advice. So take everything with an enormous grain of salt. Uh, but I think, and this is also going on a bit of a tangent here. This is different than how these industries are going to monetize, how these new entrepreneurs in these industries are going to monetize their disruption. They can monetize it in tons of ways. Some ways I could think about, some ways we have no idea about yet. We'll learn about those in the future. So how they're going to be monetized, that's a whole different discussion, a whole different set of discussions that we can have, and that's not kind of what I'm going to be getting into now. But that's a very interesting convo about how to monetize it, because there are some particular considerations here. Because, for example, when you're talking about SSRIs and talk therapy today, it's somebody that's going in like every week or every 2 weeks or every month for a long time, for a consistent amount of time. And when you're doing SSRIs or most mental health meds, you're doing it for a long time, usually daily or weekly, and you're just on it for a long, long time. Psychedelic therapies, people that understand psychedelics and psychedelic medicines and therapies, they understand that these are going to be far, far more infrequent, where you have maybe like a one-time package, and then that's it for a year or two. Look at what Field Trip is doing, for example, with ketamine, which I don't think is a real psychedelic, but look at what they're doing with ketamine, for example. So um, they have one or two or three or a number of ketamine sessions, and they have a number of kind of like integration therapy sessions after it, and maybe one or two sessions before, and for that they charge a fee. So, and then I think they are recently doing at home as well. So you have a far less frequent therapies, which is a great thing societally, which is a great thing socially, morally. That sounds like a great thing. From a purely investing perspective, however, we do need to think about how these things will be monetized, and these things probably are going to have to cost a lot more, right? A single pill of psilocybin and that whole package, it's going to, if the insurance is paying for it, they're going to have to pay a lot more, because if we're saying this the effects of this, the beneficial effects are going to last for 2 years, then you're not going to be paying 2 years of SSRIs and talk therapy. So insurance company, please make sure to pay enough to incentivize um, these new firms to be able to produce these therapies. So there's a whole big aspect with that at play, but that's a separate thing. Um, I think everyone would understand that if back to the main topic at hand, I think everyone would understand if the FDA approval was received for just a number of these new psychedelic drugs that are currently going through the FDA pipeline, like mind meds, field trips. I guess now that would be reunions after the split. I guess Numi now. I'm looking into Numi quite a bit. Numinous, um, Atai, Cybin, Compass. If just a handful of these are approved, everyone that knows anything about this space understands that the entire industry, the entire mental health industry, would be flipped upside down. That's why you have Johnson and Johnson and other big pharma companies also heavily investing in psychedelic therapies, because they don't want to be flipped upside down. They want to be part of it as well. I think AbbVie as well. AbbVie is also a big player here in terms of one of the big players, big pharma players that are kind of getting into this new research space. So That's one aspect. But I'm so excited about the psychedelic sector because I think it could be way more than just that. Where you have mental health today taking up a certain kind of portion of our GDP, and where psychedelics could potentially disrupt that completely, and these new firms could potentially completely disrupt that, including the kind of quasi aspect I talked about, and including the therapy aspect of it. Look at Field Trip, for example. They're providing the therapy, but they're also providing the therapy. They're providing the medicine, but they're also providing the therapy around it. So they're the ones that are monetizing that. So where today, like for example, say somebody's on SSRIs, they're taking SSRIs, and then every once in a while, they go to a therapist. Two different firms, two different kind of schemas, right? You have maybe a therapist who's a small business operating just out of an office, and then you have some pharmaceutical company that's making money on the drug. But today, that's today. But in the future, you may have one company successfully, potentially, wrapping itself around that whole aspect. And if imagine Field Trip captures both aspects, the drug and the therapy and everything else around it. Maybe additional services, maybe additional subscriptions, maybe additional data related or kind of technology related services that they could provide on the front end or on the back end, or in aggregate, using the data to do other things, potentially to monetize it, potentially in other ways. Obviously we'd want them to do it ethically and appropriately. I'm all for that, everything done morally and ethically, but just also putting my investor hat on, I'm thinking that from that perspective as well, and as I think any good investor must, right? But so that's the mental health aspect. Now let's jump to the second aspect. The second aspect is the recreational aspect. I think that's going to be big here. So I'm going to avoid the discussion on marijuana here, and maybe I'll do a future video on the difference between marijuana and psychedelics in terms of how kind of marijuana, once marijuana became legal in some major states in the US, how the business model for marijuana panned out versus what these psychedelic firms are trying to do. Quite different, right? Where marijuana's just went purely the retail route, psychedelics are going more of the FDA third-party payer route, where the user is not the payer, where somebody walks into MedMen, pays and gets some bud and goes home. No, instead you go to a Field Trip office, maybe in the future, and then you have this whole package, where right now, of course, you're paying for it, but in the future, maybe a psilocybin package, once it's FDA approved, an insurance company will pay a hefty amount, potentially, for that. So that's still the medical aspect of it. But clearly we see there is interest, right? Looking at marijuana, where we don't want it to end up like marijuana. We definitely want a better approach when we have our investor hat on. So maybe if we take that hat off and we put on the humanist hat, we can talk about other convos. But once we put the investor hat on, we definitely can say, as investors in these firms, we don't want them to take the approach the marijuana firms have taken so far, because the results are not that great, and it doesn't seem like it's a very profitable thing to run a retail marijuana business. Will it be that profitable for retail mushroom business? I don't know, potentially less profitable, but that's the third category, recreation. So I think if these things are legalized in the far future, like 10, 20, 30 years out, I think there will be some aspects of this type of these types of drugs, like some forms or ways or potencies that can be attained recreationally, that after enough people in the US will have done these, will realize, once enough people take it, we'll realize that, the country will realize that, look, I mean, think about what kind of better place the country is going to be when more people have done these therapies. I'm so optimistic about that. But I think the country is going to realize, look, it shouldn't always be like there's not something wrong with it. It can't be the case that there has to be a medical need for you to take it. You should be able to do it recreationally. You should be able to do it freely. And it's like, out of all the drugs you could take, from alcohol to coffee to anything, psychedelics are kind of the most mild period. You can't take them that often. You don't want to take them that often. And then they're the most, benign and beneficial in most cases, of course, if taken at the right doses. And of course, this is not medical advice at all. So what you have to understand is that there is likely to be a recreational aspect to psychedelics once we get approval. After approval, not before. After. It has to happen after. It's not going to happen before. It's severely unlikely that we'll have a situation where we have where we have legal psilocybin or LSD or any of these psychedelic drugs, DMT, and anything, even a synthetic form, it's unlikely that we'll have that in a recreational setting before we have that in a medical setting. I can't see that happening right now. It looks like FDA is going to approve these therapies, and then over time, years down the line, there will be probably some demand, some appetite, saying we just want it recreationally. Now the third aspect, so let's jump to the third aspect, which is kind of a combo of both. At first, this may be, what I'm about to say, may lean more towards the medical aspect because that's the only thing that's going to be available. But over time, once it's more once it's more accepted and once it's legal to do it recreationally, it'll be more recreational. And that's the entire bucket of using psychedelics for self-improvement purposes. So you could see how this third bucket is kind of similar like the two. It's kind of like the mix of the two, where you have for self-improvement purposes, so you're trying to improve yourself, but you're not mentally ill really, and so it's kind of more of a recreational type thing. But in this bucket, I'm talking about a different group of people, not people who are doing it at night just for themselves, but I'm talking about a group of well-off around the globe, this newly created like upper middle class or lower, like new money tier that clearly exists. Gen X, Gen Y mostly, Gen Z now as well. There's a lot of people with a lot of money that are willing to spend it on personal development, self-development, and they'd be happy to go to retreats, go to seminars, go to sessions, long kind of like seminars or sessions or retreats that will facilitate psychedelic use and have like an entire package of self-development around it. At first, you may, when it's just, I'm telling you, at first when it's just FDA approved and you need a prescription or some kind of mental health issue to get these, you're still going to have demand from all these like influencers, from all these very successful people who now deeply care about their health. Today's well-off people deeply care about their health. I mean, you can look at any well-off person today, they're not a big fat slob. Today they care about their health, and they're going to have immediately, they're going to have a strong demand. They're going to be demanding these kinds of therapies and services. It's going to be very in demand. So at first you're going to have MDs and like clinical approaches to it, but 20, 30 years down the line, you're going to have premium offerings, premium resorts, like like the Amman resorts, Amangiri, Amangana, I think, the Amman resorts, where you have ultra premium experiences like that, but more geared towards self-improvement and more geared towards psychedelic use. I think that's going to be another potential sector, and although it's not going to be as broad, not nearly as broad, right, as mental health is, because it's only for the well-off, I think there's going to be a very robust, very healthy demand for that all across the world, I think there's a lot of disposable income that would be tossed at that. So I think you have quite a bit more than just a traditional idea of psychedelics potentially disrupting mental health. I think we have psychedelics potentially being obviously disrupting mental health, being a big retail aspect. Even things that I'm not even considering. I'm talking about psychedelics delivery, psychedelics-related drinks, wines. Who knows what kind of retail aspect will be around psychedelics in 20, 30, 40 years. It could be that there's so much related to psychedelic use in the retail sense in a few decades, potentially. And then the third aspect is the self-improvement aspect, which I said is kind of like a combo of the first two. And at first it's gonna look more medicinal, but over time it's gonna look more resort-like, I think. And I think you're gonna have robust demand for people once they see the benefits of these kind of therapies. And so there's quite a bit of money, for when I put my investor hat on, there's quite a bit of money to be made in this space, right? Most of the current companies that I'm investing in now, most of the companies I'm seeing are focused on the first aspect, right? The mental health aspect, because that's what they're trying to do to get FDA approval. I don't think we're going to see these second and third tier companies, not second and third tier, but these second and third category companies, or like next gen companies in terms of the approach, like the second and third categories. These next gen companies, I don't think we're going to see them for years. I don't think we're going to see them until kind of we get at least one or two FDA approvals. We're not going to see startup. We're not going to see like a cool startup doing like a psychedelic retail resort, right? We're going to need time for that, and we're going to need to see where the culture changes and where it shifts and where it allows for certain things and where it doesn't. But I definitely think once people start taking psychedelics, once these are approved, once you got Americans taking these, you're gonna have a big change in the world, and you're gonna have a big positive change. It's quite exciting, quite exciting. And so you can't always have your investor hat on. You have to take that off sometimes and put on your humanist hat when you're talking about this. If you're talking about Tesla, if you're talking about General Motors, Ford, if you're talking about any Apple, whatever company, Twitter, Google, Microsoft, whatever, you could just keep your investor hat on. You don't really need to take that off too much. But when you're talking about psychedelics, it's so important, it's so crucial that you can't just have your investor hat. It's wrong. It's just morally wrong to only have your investor hat on. Sometimes you have to take that hat off, because investing and making money, either for yourself or for the community, for the corporation, for the company, for the country, that's not the most important thing. The most important thing is to be the best we can, to be as actualized as we can be, and to promote, whatever society you live in, to push that society to do that. And if you just have your investor hat on when you're thinking about psychedelics, you may not make some correct choices. But I think it's easy for people to take their investor hat off in the psychedelic space. If you've done psychedelics, if you've meditated, if you understand certain things that certain people understand and certain people don't. But if you do understand those things, then I think it's quite easier to take your investor hat off and to put on your humanist hat sometimes too.